Hello, I'm Frederick Chambliss Weems, and just for fun, I'm going to try to read as quickly as I can, because these videotapes I think may only last 10 minutes in most formats. I'm going to read to you the monumental decision of the United States District Court rendered December 6, 1933 by John M. Woolsey, lifting the ban on Ulysses. United States District Court, Southern District of New York, United States of America, Libelant, versus one book called Ulysses, Random House Incorporated, Claimant. Opinion A, 110 through 59. On cross motions for a decree in a libel of confiscation, supplemented by a stipulation, hereinafter described, brought by the United States against the book Ulysses by James Joyce under Section 305 of the Tariff Act of 1930, Title 19, United States Code, Section 1305, on the ground that the book is obscene within the meaning of that section and hence is not importable into the United States, but is subject to seizure, forfeiture, and confiscation and destruction. United States Attorney by Samuel C. Coleman, Esquire, and Nicholas Atlas, Esquire, of Counsel for the United States, in support of motion for a decree of forfeiture, and in opposition to motion for a decree dismissing the libel. Messrs. Greenbaum, Wolf, and Ernst by Morris L. Ernst, Esquire, and Alexander Lindy, Esquire, of Counsel, attorneys for claimant Random House, Inc., in support of motion for a decree dismissing the libel, and in opposition to motion for a decree of forfeiture. Woolsey, J. The motion for a decree dismissing the libel herein is granted, and consequently, of course, the government's motion for a decree of forfeiture and destruction is denied. Accordingly, a decree dismissing the libel without costs may be entered herein. 1. The practice followed in this case is in accordance with the suggestion made by me in the case of United States v. one book entitled Contraception, 51 F. 2nd, 525, and is as follows. After issue was joined by the filing of the claimant's answer to the libel for forfeiture against Ulysses, a stipulation was made between the United States Attorney's Office and the attorneys for the claimant, providing 1. That the book Ulysses should be deemed to have been annexed to and to have become part of the libel just as if it had been incorporated in its entirety therein. 2. That the parties waived their right to a trial by jury. 3. That each party is agreed to move for a decree in its favor. 4. That on such cross motions the court might decide all the questions of law and fact involved and render a general finding thereon. 5. That on the decision of such motions the decree of the court might be entered as if it were a decree after trial. It seems to me that a procedure of this kind is highly appropriate in libels for the confiscation of books such as this. It is an especially advantageous procedure in the instant case, because on account of the length of Ulysses and the difficulty of reading it, a jury trial would have been an extremely unsatisfactory, if not an almost impossible, method of dealing with it. 2. I have read Ulysses once in its entirety, and I have read those passages of which the government particularly complains several times. In fact, for many weeks my spare time has been devoted to the consideration of the decisions which my duty would require me to make in this matter. Ulysses is not an easy book to read or to understand, but there has been much written about it, and in order properly to approach the consideration of it, it is advisable to read a number of other books which have now become its satellites. The study of Ulysses is, therefore, a heavy task. 3. The reputation of Ulysses in the literary world, however, warranted my taking such time as was necessary to enable me to satisfy myself as to the intent with which the book was written, for of course, in any case where a book is claimed to be obscene, it must first be determined whether the intent with which it was written was what is called, according to the usual phrase, pornographic, that is, written for the purpose of exploiting obscenity. If the conclusion is that the book is pornographic, that is the end of the inquiry, and forfeiture must follow. But in Ulysses, in spite of its unusual frankness, I do not detect anywhere the leer of the sensualist. I hold, therefore, that it is not pornographic. 4. In writing Ulysses, Joyce sought to make a serious experiment in a new, if not wholly novel, literary genre. He takes persons of the lower middle class living in Dublin in 1904 and seeks not only to describe what they did on a certain day early in June of that year as they went about the city bent on their usual occupations, but also to tell what many of them thought about the while. Joyce has attempted, it seems to me with astonishing success, to show how the screen of consciousness, with its ever-shifting kaleidoscopic impressions, carries, as it were on a plastic palimpsest, not only what is in the focus of each man's observation of the actual things about him, but also in a penumbral zone residua of past impressions, some recent and some drawn up by associations from the domain of the subconscious. He shows how each of these impressions affects the life and behavior of the character with which he is describing. What he seeks to get at What he seeks to get is not unlike the results of a double or, if that is possible, a multiple exposure on a cinema film, which would give a clear foreground with a background visible but somewhat blurred and out of focus in varying degrees. To convey by words an effect which obviously lends itself more appropriately to a graphic technique accounts, it seems to me, for much of the obscenity which meets a reader of Ulysses, and it also explains another aspect of the book which I have further to consider, namely Joyce's sincerity and his honest effort to show exactly how the minds of his characters operate. If Joyce did not attempt to be honest in developing the technique which he has adopted in Ulysses, the result would be psychologically misleading and thus unfaithful to his chosen technique. Such an attitude would be artistically inexcusable. It is because Joyce has been loyal to his technique and has not funked its necessary implications, but has honestly attempted to tell fully what his characters think about, that he has been the subject of so many attacks, and that his purpose has been so often misunderstood and misrepresented. For his attempt sincerely and honestly to realize his objective has required him incidentally to use certain words which are generally considered dirty words, and has led at times to what many think is a too poignant preoccupation with sex in the thoughts of his characters. The words which are criticized are dirty as old. The words which are criticized as dirty are old Saxon words, known to almost all men, and I venture to many women, and are such words as would be naturally and habitually used, I believe, by the types of folk whose life, physical and mental, Joyce is seeking to describe. In respect of the recurrent emergence of the theme of sex in the minds of his characters, it must always be remembered that his locale was Celtic and his season spring. Whether or not one enjoys such a technique as Joyce uses is a matter of taste, on which disagreement or argument is futile, but to subject that technique to the standards of some other technique seems to me to be little short of absurd. Accordingly, I hold that Ulysses is a sincere and honest book, and I think that the criticisms of it are entirely disposed of by its rationale. Furthermore, Ulysses is an amazing tour de force when one considers the success which has been in the main achieved with such a difficult objective as Joyce set for himself. As I have stated, Ulysses is not an easy book to read. It is brilliant and dull, intelligible and obscure by turns. In many places it seems to me to be disgusting, but although it contains, as I have mentioned above, many words usually considered dirty, I have not found anything that I consider to be dirt for dirt's sake. Each word of the book contributes like a bit of mosaic to the detail of the picture which Joyce is seeking to construct for his readers. If one does not wish to associate with such folk as Joyce describes, that is one's own choice. In order to avoid indirect contact with them, one may not wish to read Ulysses. That is quite understandable. But when such a real artist in words, as Joyce undoubtedly is, seeks to draw a true picture of the lower middle class in a European city, ought it to be impossible for the American public legally to see that picture? To answer this question, it is not sufficient merely to find, as I have found above, that Joyce did not write Ulysses with what is commonly called pornographic intent. I must endeavor to apply a more objective standard to his book in order to determine its effect in the result, irrespective of the intent with which it was written. I'll continue the rest of this in Part 2.